Hey everyone. So this is just a introduction to the last module of this course, which I have labeled as about simulation and poiesis. And alongside simulation, of course, we could have simulacra, which is Baudrillard's book that we're looking at. So I want to make a few comments on elements of this. As usual, I'm assuming that you're doing all the readings and all of those sorts of things, and that you will have things to say about all of this in the discussion area. So I just want to kind of hit a few high points, and I guess the first place to start is that there may feel like there's a kind of tension between these two kind of central concepts that I'm starting with here. I mean, simulation, or Baudrillard's notion of simulacra, feels a little bit like a kind of removal from reality, especially material reality. It feels like a hall of mirrors, a bunch of images. We can't tell what's real from what's not real, and it doesn't even matter anymore what is real and what's not real, because we're not using the real as a category for anything at all. And so that's the case on the one side, and on the other side, this notion of poiesis is connected to creativity, and I think those who are engaged in the creative disciplines, whether that's writing, whether that's production of various sorts, theater, music, whatever it is, would want to speak to the groundedness and the kind of, even if they don't use the word material nature of it, there's a kind of, creativity just doesn't come from sitting there and thinking about something, nor does it necessarily come from a kind of abstract world where nothing matters and nothing makes sense. It only seems to matter once we can play off of things that matter to people. Right? I mean, you're not really creative. You're just random. And we're going to talk a little bit about randomness. I mean, some of our readings are very much about randomness as an element of creativity. But so we're going to talk about that kind of interesting tension. And I think, in some elements or some ways, maybe there's some kind of interesting and, dare I say, creative space to explore in all of that. As you can see in the module here, I have listed for the theories modernism and postmodernism. And so, just a word about that. I used to teach a course called Modern Humanities, and the kind of theme of the entire course was to think about what it means to be modern, and think about what, if anything, comes after that. So we thought about the modern in a lot of different contexts. Philosophers talk about the modern in a certain sense as starting with people like Descartes, because it represents a turn away from certain forms of philosophizing towards other kinds of forms of philosophizing. In particular, emphasizing or focusing on our own abilities as humans, and what it looks like to start thinking about reality and about everything within reality from that perspective, as opposed to the perspective of, let's say, creations of God, or beings within a kind of already set cosmos or universe or something like that. So that's the philosopher's story. But, of course, if you're in other disciplines, that it's a very different story. I mean, we use the term modern in literature, to designate a very different kind of activity. And really, for many people within literature, the modern has ended. We think about the modern as a period in time when we were trying to accomplish certain kinds of things like getting at pure emotion or some pure human experience, distilling things down. We see that in literature. We certainly see it in art, right? I mean, we could tell a story in painting, for example, about the rise of that kind of process from the late 19th century up until the middle of the 20th century, where we're trying to successively get at a distilled human experience of some sort. And so art gets more and more abstract. You end up with people like Mark Rothko, where you get color fields and you get abstract expressionism and all these sorts of things. And then you get Andy Warhol, who is doing something entirely different, right? So he's grounding art back in the world, but it's in this case the capitalist world quite often, or the political world, or the material world. And so he's doing images of Brillo boxes or Marilyn Monroe or whatever like that. And so there's a kind of turn which means that you can put the modern as a particular kind of project that that we got, I don't know what to say, bored with, or started to question as to whether that was a project that we really wanted to engage in. You can tell a similar story about architecture. And again, you would place modern architecture as a particular kind of project. And people kind of become skeptical about that project at a certain point. So that's why we talk about the postmodern, right? Not because, the postmodern ends up meaning all sorts of different things. We hardly use that term anymore in academia. I actually discourage students from using it because often it's, really just meant as a kind of big, bin that you throw in everything that you either love or you don't love, and either, argue for it or against it, and it ends up being a very squishy kind of category. But I think it still can make sense to talk about it, at least as the exhaustion of a project of modernity, however we're defining modernism, whether it's in the arts or in culture or whatever it is. There is a certain sense that that project has become exhausted, and now what comes after that? So, so that's, I'm linking that because Baudrillard is often, grouped among the postmoderns. He's talking about a kind of exhaustion of the project of modernism when it comes to really, all of culture, but especially visuality. So you can see here on the module page that, as usual, I've got a bunch of kind of related concepts, and I've split them down between simulation and poiesis here. As I say, I want to kind of see how those two things exist in tension and also exist, in a necessary relationship with each other. So probably the place to start is with Baudrillard, because in some ways he's the kind of central figure for the week, and many of you have probably already read Baudrillard in some form or fashion. It's a classic work. In the first Matrix movie, Thomas Anderson, or Neo, was reading Baudrillard. We get a little shot of that, simulation and simulacra, actually. And so the point for Baudrillard, in a certain sense, I put it down here in the module, is that there is a kind of, if you wish, exhaustion of representation, right? So he identifies three different kinds of representation. So there's first order. That's a representation of the real, and there's obviously a difference between what is real and what is artificial. So you might draw a picture of something, and draw a picture of a tree, and so there's a tree out there. That's the real thing, and your picture is a representation of that tree. And so that we all know. But there's that border becomes blurred, especially in the digital world, but even before that, where the border between reality and representation is just not quite as clear as it once was. We don't really know which one is which. And so, the examples I like to think about are the beginning of photography in the 19th century. It's really quite fascinating to think about how photography, in a certain sense, takes over from painting the job of representing reality, and yet right from the beginning, we realized that it could be manipulated, and it could be manipulated in a number of different ways. People could manipulate the scene that they are shooting. So there are some very famous photographs where, there's, let's say, a battlefield scene which is shot well after the battle. It was not during the battle itself at all, but somebody staged it, essentially. And so that feels a little bit like how we would think about painting in a certain sense, because, no painting is a snapshot. Every painting is a construction. But, once we get photography, we get this kind of sense that maybe we can just kind of get a snapshot of reality, and so that brings us closer to what actually happened. So we can stage the scene that we're shooting, but we can also manipulate the image itself, right? I mean, we realize quite early on that we can, scratch on the negative. We can, we can colorize it. We can do all sorts of different things to it. This is long before Photoshop, and so there's this kind of dual, weird tension in that photography picks up from painting the kind of task of representing reality, and it's regarded as doing that more successfully. And yet at the same time, we realize from very early on that it is also one of the greatest tools to actually fool us about the nature of reality itself. So now we live in a world where these two things must coexist with each other. And so that feels like a second order sort of phenomenon, it seems to me. And then we get to this third order, where Baudrillard wants to talk about not just a simulation, but a simulacra. And so there's a reversal, as we see here. The representation in some sense precedes the real, and in fact in some ways produces it. So it produces what Baudrillard calls the hyperreal. And so the examples that we could use are things like from Foucault talking about prisons hiding the fact that society itself is the prison. We think that prisoners are the ones who have lost their freedom, and in fact, Foucault would argue it's actually us. The two social realms are in fact similar to each other. Disneyland or Disney World, not just a second order simulation where the fake mountains look more real than real, but a third order one. It's there to conceal the fact that it is the real country. All of real America, in fact, is Disneyland. And so we go there thinking that we are having an escape, when in fact it's simply hiding from us the fact that there's a kind of superficiality and a theme park sensibility to our lives themselves. And so Baudrillard is obviously this is very provocative, and he is kind of trying to give us a sense of how these three things work. And so you can see here we have different kinds of terms that would associate themselves with these different things. So, we can talk about, in the first order, a counterfeit, in second order, a production, in the third order, a simulation. You can go down this entire list here, and you can see how he's talking about just a fundamentally different way of thinking about the world. And I would add to it, it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what we do with ideas around representation as well. And we're going to come to talk about that a little bit more later, in my introduction here. So that's the idea of the simulacra for Baudrillard. And we have a few quotes here. You can read them for yourself. But he kind of brings the point home of how it is that we, in effect, live in a world at this point where we really can't tell the difference between what is real and what isn't real. And we could make this argument even within the kind of current political state that we find ourselves in. It's very difficult to pin down any real concepts. Lots of stuff swirls around about DEI and about being woke and about critical race theory and all of these sorts of things, but they hardly ever actually have a definition to them, and that's deliberate because it opens the door to action, to be able to act upon these things by those who want to reorder the American society. And so what we have is a kind of it feels in a certain sense like you never really know what's going on. You don't know what the firm foundation is that you stand on anymore. And, I think the argument would be that it's not just the current political regime that has brought that into being. That was, in some sense, always there, or at least always there, over the last few decades. It was just better disguised. But now it's out in the open. And it's disorienting. It's really, really hard to know how to go forward with that. And so the question of how we live in a world where, we don't have the old assurances anymore. We don't have the structure of, the king and the servants, or God and subjects. God and and creation, and we don't have any of that, or at least nothing that people are willing to take seriously. It might be forced upon them, but it is a forcing. It's not something that people are going to willingly accept themselves. So I've got a few videos here as well that you can take a look at. There's a Baudrillard video that I think is not too bad. This stuff is kind of all over the place. I know if you saw The Matrix or any of the kind of subsequent movies, you know that there's a lot of ideas bouncing around there, and it's kind of like, like the Wachowskis never met an idea they didn't like, and so they kind of jammed them all in. But there is a kind of method to the madness, I think. I think it's easy to suppose that there's a kind of what you might think of as dualistic or even, Manichaean sort of sense. There is a world of illusion, and, the majority of people have the wool pulled over their eyes and they live in that world. And then there are those few who see what's really going on, and that's Neo, and that's the people around Neo. And so that's the rhetoric right now of the the current political regime, that they are the ones who see the reality and all the rest of us don't. But you can tell that story with any number of people claiming that they're the ones that see reality and everyone else doesn't. And so that in a certain sense feels like a kind of Manichaean, or I sometimes think of it as a Gnostic or neo-Gnostic way of thinking about postmodernism. Really, postmodernism isn't usually sliced down quite that neatly. It's not that there are some who see and that there are others who don't. In a certain sense, we all have had the wool pulled over our eyes. We are all, struggling to figure out what's going on. Those who claim the true knowledge of things really are simply asserting it and not claiming it on any kind of real basis. So that's Baudrillard, and it's reinforced by the readings from the Gain and Beer book, and there's the chapter on simulation, which I think does a nice job of kind of giving you a quick overview of that, and it talks a little bit about Hales as well, and Kittler and a few others as well in relation to that. Really kind of raises the question of how we live in a world that looks like that. And that is a hard question, right? I mean, that's more than just a kind of academic question. That's a question that, I would argue people feel this in their bones, whether they're academics or not. I've asked you to read also the conclusion of the book in this chapter as well, since we're at the end, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I think they do a nice job of relating the concepts that we've looked over for the past few weeks. And so you can take a look through how they do that. So I want to turn to what we have in the New Media Reader for a bit as well. And the parts I've assigned to you are mostly quite short this time, and they're really, I think, pretty interesting, and they're really more focused on that kind of poiesis side, or the creativity side of what's going on here. So, we see a few of these. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but what I want to point out in general with these is that they're really attempting to kind of break through, especially the early ones, break through a kind of modernist view of the structure of reality. So how are they doing that? Well, the idea of the happenings really are about injecting a kind of randomness and injecting a kind of, serendipity. I don't know if that's the word. So this is drawing on things like Dadaism and Surrealism and Situationists International and all of those sorts of things to try and do something new. And you see that also with the William S. Burroughs piece as well, the cut-up method of Brion Gysin. So the cut-ups are a way of kind of jarring yourself out of the, the kind of patterns or paths that you have become used to, and doing it by a kind of close attention to the real world. I mean, in this case, the real world is existing text, right? And so that's a kind of materiality that is reconfigured into something new. The other readings we have, the Roy Ascot, is looking at cybernetics and creativity as well. The kind of Garden Party reading is really about more experimentalism in art. The Namjoon Paik, cybernated art, same thing. He's early proponent or early artist with video art and television, using television in art. And finally, we have Augusto Boal, who's been mentioned earlier in this course, who is really focused on theater. And, he is kind of bursting the bounds of how we think about theater. And he's not by no means the only one to do this, but he is really trying to kind of see the theatrical in the lived experience of people and see the lived experience in the theatrical. He's really trying to kind of break down those borders. He's somebody who, ran for office in one office, much to the annoyance of the right wing in Brazil. And, and he really used some of his theater techniques to try and get those kind of social questions, the kind of questions of the oppressed on the table. What does it mean to live as people who do not have the kind of, central place in society? And so I've got a couple of videos that kind of cash that out a little bit here as well that you can take a look at. Well, I had mentioned earlier as well that I wanted to talk just briefly about representation, because this really is in some sense about how we think about representation. We might think about theory as an exercise in representing the world. A theory is an attempt to, let's say, make a model of how things are, what reality looks like. Well, that's a representation. And so, Baudrillard is, in a certain sense, asking us to be a little skeptical of representations, of the ability to make them in the first place, the ability to see that they actually represent what we think should be represented out there, the ability to kind of make a distinction between the world out there, which is the thing being represented, and our faculty of representing it. And so it's really, in a certain sense, a challenge to theory to question representation. But I think that's where the stuff on creativity comes in, on poiesis, right? If we start becoming skeptical about representation, we can at least see the task of a theorist as one who is creating a space to ask a new question, creating a space to develop a new concept that's adequate to the experience of the situation or the people or whatever that we're talking about. In other words, it's not necessarily about coming up with a representation that says, okay, here's the world out there, and now we have a picture of it that most accurately and most faithfully helps us to understand what's going on. I think we'll never get away from that kind of activity, and nor should we maybe, but I think we can see that theory becomes something a little bit more than that. No matter what discipline you're in, I think that there is a limit to what theory can accomplish, right? And I'm saying that as a theorist, right? I mean, I want to recognize that, when we think about theory, we need to think about non-theory as well. What is outside of theory? What is untheorizable, or what resists it? Or is there anti-theory? Or is there, what does that look like? And that doesn't mean that we stop theorizing or that we stop using theory to try and make sense out of the world. But it does mean that the world cannot be contained by whatever theoretical, tool or approach that we bring to it. And so what do we do under those conditions, right? What do we do if that's the truth, right? I mean, we're not going to just give it all up and say, well, okay, so we can't really understand, and, it's all whatever, any individual wants to believe or something like that. That's not what I'm saying at all, right? What I'm saying is that it's a complicated relationship. You're not going to get a knockdown, true for everyone, perfect model of pretty much anything. And I would go so far as extending that even to the sciences. We've been mostly talking in the humanities here, but even in the sciences, I think there's a provisionality to theory, and there are elements of different layers of accounts that may happen within theoretical structures, such that it's very difficult to say, now we've got it, now we can just put that on the shelf, don't need to ask any questions about that anymore, we can move on. So if we're talking about representation, I've given you a bunch of definitions of it here, and there are terms related to representation. We've got some examples, and I think that helps see that we use the term in a lot of different ways. So like the obvious ones like drawings and paintings, but A lawyer represents a client. A movie might represent a book, and that's going to be a very different thing than what a painter does in trying to, like, say, paint a tree. Signs and symbols represent. So this goes back to our previous discussions on semiotics. Representative government, right? I mean, that's a different sense of representation again. So you can think about what representation means in these things and what the limits of it actually are. And along with that, I guess, is Baudrillard right? Should we be fundamentally skeptical, in a kind of global sense or in a kind of more limited sense? Clearly we couldn't get through the world without representing anything at all. But Baudrillard's point is that we really can't tell the difference anymore. Our representations and our reality have become so mixed, not just interdependent, but, we don't know where one starts and the other ends. So we can look at the history of representation here. I'm not going to go through this. You can take a look at it. But using the example of how do we represent a rose, and I've given you a bunch of different, images of this. We're talking visual representations here. And you can see that they get increasingly, strange. Some of them are pretty straightforward, but I kind of unpack each of them here. So you can think about roses as artistic representations or as temporal objects, as eternal or permanent qualities of something. So it used to be that, people thought that they only represented something when they captured its true essence. But maybe that's not possible. So maybe we represent the rose in a textbook. Maybe we're representing the experience of a rose. Maybe we are representing the rose as a sign or a symbol. And I've given you some examples of that here. Maybe we represent the rose as constituent parts of the rose. So maybe we just give you a copy of its DNA. And maybe roses are nothing but copies in and of themselves. And so, we are getting increasingly closer to the Baudrillardian kind of despair or questioning towards representation. And I think that has to be kept in mind, even, especially as theorists, if what we think we're doing is representing something. So I end off with a few more videos for you to watch, that deal with simulation in various ways, and if we were in class, we'd probably watch some of these and talk a little bit about what simulation is and also what creativity is. John Cleese, I don't always agree with his approach to creativity, but I put it on there because he's a fairly well-known person who discusses that. Right, so that is kind of the intro to this module. And, I guess this is the end of the course. I hope that this trip through a lot of different concepts has kind of made you think about what it means to be a theorist, right? I mean, as I said right from the beginning of the course, it was never my goal to give you a bunch of theories and give you like a little, kind of superficial, few points about each of them, right? I mean, that seems impossible, and that feels like it's very pedantic, and it feels like you're not going to take away very much from that. What I really want is to make you into theorists, right? To be able to see how thinking theoretically will help you to kind of grasp whatever it is that you're doing in a new way, and and open some doors for you. I mean, I think ultimately that's what theory has to do. As with your papers, it all starts with a good question, and so that question is going to imply the tools that you might want to use or find useful in all of this. But that's been the goal. I think, if you think in those terms, I hope that you're going to be able to take something from what we've talked about in this course and apply it or use it in whatever other course and in your research and on past that as well. So, as I've said in class, I will, the end of the course isn't the end of the course. I'm more than happy to talk to you whatever, whenever, after the course is over. If you're working on something, if you're thinking about something, suggest theorists, suggest approaches, whatever. I would like to continue the conversation if you're interested in doing that. So yeah, so that is what we got here, and it has been a real pleasure to be in this course with you. I always feel like teaching a course of this sort, I learn as much as anyone else does, because all of you bring so much to the table. Your backgrounds are very accomplished in many ways, in ways that I don't have in my background, and that's great. I mean, that's what this should be. This should be an exchange and thinking through things together. So right, so I look forward to your papers, and I look forward to the discussions in the discussion area. So thanks everyone, and I will talk to you soon.